They called it the backbone of the Luftwaffe. Fast, deadly, proven in battle from Spain to Stalingrad. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was Germany's answer to air supremacy, flown by legends, feared across Europe. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. That narrow landing gear could snap your spine on takeoff. That cramped cockpit became a coffin if you needed to bail out. And as the war dragged on, that once legendary fighter became a flying tomb for boys with barely 20 hours of training. This is the story of why flying the Bf 109 was one of the most dangerous jobs in the entire war. Not because of the enemy, but because of the machine itself. The Dream Machine. In the beginning, the Bf 109 seemed like the future. When it first roared over Spanish skies in 1937, testing itself in the crucible of the Spanish Civil War, it was revolutionary. Sleek, modern, bristling with speed. Willy Messerschmitt had designed an interceptor, not a dogfighter, a knife, not a sword. Everything about it was built for one purpose: climb fast, strike hard, dominate the vertical battlefield. Its Daimler-Benz engine delivered raw, uncompromising power. In early models, over 1,000 horsepower. Later variants pushed past 1,800. That gave it a climb rate that could embarrass almost anything the Allies fielded in the early war. Its armament was focused and brutal. Cannon mounted in the nose, machine guns synchronized through the propeller arc. When a 109 opened fire, everything converged on a single point. There was no spray and pray, just precision devastation. And it was small, compact, a tight, angular predator that could slice through the air with minimal drag. In 1940, over the beaches of Dunkirk and the fields of France, it seemed unstoppable. British Hurricanes struggled to keep pace. Even the legendary Spitfire met its match in the hands of experienced Luftwaffe pilots. For Germany, the Bf 109 became a symbol of technological superiority. Aces like Werner Mulders, Adolf Galland, and Erich Hartmann racked up kill after kill, their names becoming synonymous with the aircraft itself. But there was a cost to all that performance, a trade-off that engineers made in the quest for speed and power, and that trade-off would kill thousands. Design flaws hidden in plain sight. The trouble started the moment you climbed in. The cockpit of a Bf 109 was cramped, brutally so. Your shoulders pressed against metal. Your knees nearly touched the instrument panel. The canopy sat inches above your head, and visibility, especially to the rear, was abysmal. One German pilot described it as flying inside a coffin with a window. The controls were heavy, unforgiving. The stick required constant pressure, especially at high speeds. There was no hydraulic assistance, no smoothness. Every maneuver was a wrestling match with the aircraft. And then there was the landing gear. Here lay the Bf 109's most infamous flaw. To keep the fuselage narrow and streamlined, Messerschmitt mounted the landing gear not on the wings, but inboard, close to the centerline of the aircraft. This made the gear track incredibly narrow, barely 8 feet from wheel to wheel. It looked elegant on paper. In practice, it was a death trap. On takeoff, the torque from that massive propeller would yank the nose violently to the left. Pilots had to fight the rudder pedals just to keep the aircraft straight. Lose focus for even a second, and the 109 would ground loop, spinning out of control, collapsing the landing gear, often flipping entirely. Experienced pilots learned to manage it. But for the hundreds of young men rushed through training in the later years of the war, it was a nightmare. More Bf-109s were destroyed in takeoff and landing accidents than some entire models of Allied fighters lost in combat. One Luftwaffe instructor grimly noted, "We lost more students to the runway than to the enemy." And if you survived takeoff, the fight had only just begun. The crucible of combat. In the air, the Bf-109 demanded respect. It could climb like a rocket, dive like a stone, and in the hands of a skilled pilot, it could dance. Tight rolls, snap turns, vertical maneuvers that left opponents gasping. But skill was the key word, because the 109 forgave nothing. Its controls stiffened dramatically at high speed. In a dive, pulling out required every ounce of strength a pilot had. Some men blacked out from the G-forces before they could level off. Others simply couldn't pull hard enough and flew straight into the ground. The narrow landing gear created another problem: ground stability. On rough airfields, common across the Eastern Front and North Africa, the 109 was a liability. It tipped easily. It dug into soft earth. It punished any pilot who landed with even a slight drift. And God help you if you had to bail out. The canopy was hinged on the right side and opened to the side, not upward like many Allied designs. In an emergency, especially in a spin or inverted, that canopy became a trap. Pilots struggled to force it open against airflow, against centrifugal forces, against sheer panic. Many didn't make it out. One survivor recalled, "I tried 3 times to push the canopy. It wouldn't budge. I thought I was finished. Only when the plane started to stall did the pressure release enough for me to get out. By then I was maybe 1,000 feet from the ground. For those who did escape, there was still the matter of the tail. Bailing out meant launching yourself backward, directly into the path of the stabilizer. Broken legs, shattered spines, and worse, were common. The 109 was a fighter that killed its own pilots, not out of malice, but out of uncompromising design priorities. But the deadliest phase of the 109's story was yet to come, because as the war turned against Germany, the aircraft would face a threat more insidious than any enemy fighter: the collapse of training, the desperation of the Reich, and the sacrifice of children. The death spiral. By 1943, everything had changed. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was bleeding. Over the Eastern Front, Soviet fighters swarmed in numbers the Germans could not match. Over the Reich itself, American P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts prowled with impunity, escorting waves of bombers that turned cities into ash. Germany needed pilots, desperately, but fuel was scarce, time was scarce, everything was scarce. In the early years of the war, a Luftwaffe pilot might train for over 200 hours before seeing combat. They learned aerobatics, gunnery, navigation, emergency procedures. They flew until the aircraft felt like an extension of their own body. By 1944, new pilots were lucky to get 30 hours. Some received less than 20. And then they were strapped into a Bf-109, an aircraft that punished mistakes with death, and sent up to face pilots who had flown hundreds of missions. It was a slaughter. Young men, barely out of their teens, took off from muddy airstrips in machines they barely understood. The torque twisted them off the runway. The controls fought them in the air. And when the Mustangs or Yaks appeared, there was no time to learn, no chance to adapt. One German pilot, who survived the war, described his first combat sortie. "I had 16 hours in the 109. 16. I didn't even know how to properly trim the aircraft." When the Americans bounced us, I froze. My wingman died in the first pass. I only survived because they chased someone else. The statistics tell the story in cold numbers. In 1944 alone, the Luftwaffe lost over 15,000 aircraft. Thousands of pilots were killed, not in heroic dogfights, but in senseless accidents, botched takeoffs, stalls, spins, and collisions. The Bf 109, once a weapon of precision, had become a blunt instrument of desperation. And the pilots? They were expendable. The human cost. Behind every statistic was a name, a face, a family that would never see their son again. Franz Stiegler, a veteran ace, later recalled, "We stopped learning their names. There was no point. They would be dead in a week." The psychological toll was crushing. Veteran pilots watched wave after wave of boys arrive, wide-eyed and terrified, only to vanish. Some died on their first mission. Others lasted a few days. The 109 itself became a source of dread. Pilots whispered about the curse of the narrow gear, the killer canopy, the widowmaker dive characteristics. One pilot described the ritual before every flight. You'd check your parachute 3 times. You'd run through every emergency procedure in your head. Not because you feared the enemy, but because you feared the machine. And the Reich offered no comfort. There were no safety improvements, no redesigns, no concessions to inexperience. The war machine demanded bodies, and the Bf 109 consumed them. For the families back home, the letters were identical. Your son died bravely in defense of the fatherland. No details, no explanation. Just another name added to a list that grew longer every day. Even the aces, the survivors, carried scars. Erich Hartmann, the highest scoring ace in history, admitted after the war, "Every time I climbed into that cockpit, I wondered if this would be the day. Not because of the enemy, but because of the aircraft itself. It was always trying to kill you." The Bf 109 was not just a fighter. It was a crucible that sorted the living from the dead, the skilled from the desperate. And by 1945, there were far more of the latter. The bitter end. By the spring of 1945, the Bf 109 had become a ghost. Luftwaffe units were shadows of their former selves. Fuel was rationed to the point of absurdity. Some pilots received just enough for a single sortie. Airfields were cratered by Allied bombing. Spare parts were non-existent. And still, the 109 flew. Boys with 10 hours of training took to the skies in battered, patched-together machines. They faced swarms of Allied fighters, flown by veterans with hundreds of hours of combat time. The outcome was inevitable. Entire squadrons were wiped out in minutes. Aircraft that limped back to base often crashed on landing. Pilots too exhausted, too inexperienced, too broken to bring them down safely. One American P-51 pilot recalled, "We stopped feeling like hunters. It felt like murder. They'd come up, barely holding formation, and we'd just tear through them." Some didn't even fire back. The final days of the Bf 109 were not heroic. They were tragic. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, thousands of 109s sat abandoned on airfields across Europe. Some were destroyed by their own crews. Others were captured and studied by the Allies. But the stories, the real stories, stayed with the men who survived. They remembered the screaming engine on takeoff, the canopy that wouldn't open, the wingman who spun into the ground, the names they tried to forget. The Bf 109 had been the backbone of the Luftwaffe, but in the end, it broke the backs of those who flew it. Legacy. of the death trap. The Bf-109 was not an evil machine. It was simply unforgiving. In the hands of an expert, it was sublime. Erich Hartmann scored 352 kills in the 109. Gerhard Barkhorn earned 301. For them, the aircraft's flaws were manageable, its strengths overwhelming. But for every Hartmann, there were 1,000 boys who never stood a chance. The 109's legacy is a reminder that not all weapons are created equal. That design choices, narrow landing gear, heavy controls, a cramped cockpit can mean the difference between life and death. It is also a reminder of war's cruelty, of how desperation turns machines into coffins and young men into statistics. Today, preserved Bf-109s sit in museums around the world. They are beautifully restored, polished to perfection, admired for their lines and their history. But stand close to one. Look at that narrow gear. Peer into that cramped cockpit. Imagine the fear of a 19-year-old boy, hands shaking, as he tries to wrestle it off the runway for the first time. The Bf-109 was a masterpiece of engineering, but for thousands who flew it, it was something else entirely. A sentence, a gamble, a machine that demanded everything and forgave nothing. The Bf-109 was the backbone of the Luftwaffe, but for many who flew it, that backbone was broken on takeoff, in combat, or in the desperate final days of a dying Reich. If you want to keep exploring the untold stories of the warbirds that shaped history, the triumphs, the tragedies, and the truths no one talks about, make sure you subscribe, because every aircraft has a story, and not all of them are about glory. Some are about survival, and some are about what happens when survival is no longer an option.